Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, everybody. This week we're talking about hijacked by emotion and the amygdala's hidden power. Ever reacted impulsively and wondered why? We're going to dive into this fascinating topic with my friend and our expert guest today, Jay Gulinello. He has his master's degree in clinical human nutrition, and I love learning from him. So discover how this primal brain response influences our emotions, especially in high stress or dogmatic environments. In this episode, we explore the science behind the amygdala's override of rational thought, how nutrition plays a pivotal role in emotional regulation and preventing these hijacks, the hidden impacts of historical events like the Flexner Report and the rise of Crisco on our health and dietary guidelines, and strategies to foster critical thinking and maintain objectivity in a world filled with consensus narratives. Join us for an eye-opening discussion that blends neuroscience, nutrition, and history, offering insights to better manage our reactions and health. Don't miss this deep dive into understanding how our brains and diets intertwine. Listen now and empower yourself with knowledge. Hey, everybody. I am here with my friend Jay, and I'm so grateful he's taken the time to break down some nutrition dogma with us. So will you just kick it off with introducing a little bit about yourself and where is the best place to contact you or find you and learn more from you?
Sure. Well, Megan, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, we've known each other in the internet space for a while, so it's fun to actually connect in person. Probably the best two places would be Instagram, which is Perpetual Health CO. And also, actually, you can find me on Substack and you can find me on Rumble, where I'm doing more audio podcasting and now doing some video work there as well. That's all. You can find that if you just search Perpetual Health. And, my story is pretty interesting. I actually came from a very creative background. So I've been a musician and an actor for forever. That's what I wanted to do with my life. I went to Berkeley for an undergrad and I really wanted to, I wanted to be the next Beatles or the next Queen or, Led Zeppelin, all my favorite bands. And I moved to New York. And then all of a sudden I realized New York is very expensive and you're not going to get a steady paycheck as an actor and a musician. So I became a personal trainer. And at that point I realized, boy, I couldn't get the results for clients that I wanted to without a better understanding of nutrition. And that launched me into this whole world of nutrition and found out just surprisingly to me that it was just as much of a passion as acting and music. And I love it. And this is coming from someone, so everybody that's listening to this, it's never too late because this is coming from someone who really didn't do very well in chemistry in high school. I was not a very good chemistry student because I just didn't think it wasn't applying to my life. I was going to be a musician. That's all I cared about. So I had no use for it. But then I fast forward, I get into grad school and I take my first biochemistry class and I'm literally sweating bullets thinking I'm not going to make it. And I did fantastic, and I aced all those classes because I had a newfound respect and love for the process. And I think, in a bigger picture, anything in life that you love, you tend to be better at. And if you spend your time doing the things that you love, I feel like you'll find success in that area. That's just like a little life lesson that I've learned so far.
I also can relate so much to your story. And I feel like it's like when you really tap into your genius, which can flow into many different areas, that it's a passion and you also don't really feel so much sense of competitiveness. You just love to be with other like-minded creative folks. You just want to pour your genius into their genius and watch their brain. Like I'm excited for our brains to collaborate on this project. Like that's exciting. So, I am a circus performer and a puppeteer and, a dancer with hula hoops. So I totally understand. That same thing happened to me in Portland, Oregon. I moved out there after I graduated with my degree in dietetics, realized there was no way I was going to be able to make money just being a professional hula hooper and fire dancer. So it was like personal trainer by day, circus performer by night. And that was really an interesting kind of world to navigate. And yes, that's definitely why we connect on our passion for nutrition. And same here, I got like D's in chemistry 101 and 103. It was so hard. I was like in his office being like, no, dude. I was like really trying to understand. But then once I got to biochemistry, I was so immersed in it. And I remember just looking at like a plate of food, even just like something like I remember thinking this in college, like a chocolate chip morsel and how like small it might look to your eye. I was like, this is so big to your cells.
Yeah.
we eat food and poop it out is a freaking miracle. And we need to talk about this more. And so, yeah, I can relate to your passion a lot, if you can tell. So thanks for sharing that little nugget too, because finding your genius and also being adaptable and like understanding that, you can still have your passion in music. You can still have your creative genius in other ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. I tend to, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but I tend to try to remove the passion from nutrition, because I feel like sometimes the passion, and I know this is going to segue us nicely into the initial topic, but I feel like the passion can sometimes remove us from thinking in a more logical pattern. And so I just did a podcast earlier this morning where I was explaining to them energy production in the mitochondria. And when I did that, it really kind of, again, it removed the higher level thinking from food. In other words, so instead of looking at meat as meat or a potato or olive oil, I was looking at it in terms of how it becomes electrons and hydrogen protons and how that can provide energy for the cell. And all of a sudden, when you get to the end of the talk and you realize, wow, all these foods provide this nutrition, but from the higher level, like if you're talking about like a vegan or a carnivore, they have a specific way they want to get those nutrients into the body. And I want to remove all that stuff, because I have my biases, you have yours, we all do, but owning them up front is really important, being transparent with people, but also removing some of that passion and bringing it back down to a scientific level. I don't know, it just makes it a little bit easier for people to grasp the concept. So that's a great, I know that's probably going to segue us nicely into what we want to talk about here, but that's how I try to approach things, just so the audience has an idea of my mindset.
Yeah. And I've also been working towards that mindset as well, is understanding intellectual humility is truly the way of approaching science, and understanding that we will all have our bias, but it doesn't have to turn into a dogma. And that's that fine balance. So yeah, it does transition us well into the concept of the amygdala hijack, which is why we want to talk about it here on Taste of Truth Tuesdays, is that it's a powerful mechanism in the brain that, when triggered by fear or stress, can override rational thinking and lead to immediate emotional reactions. So in dogmatic communities, which we talk a lot about here, this mechanism is often exploited to enforce conformity and control. That's why we want to talk about it. We need to understand, how can we be more critical in our thinking? How can we have more emotional regulation? And turning down the passion, or understanding how that influences our bias and can almost put up boundaries and walls, is also part of the group identity concept that we'll see. Like, if I'm a vegan, if I'm a carnivore, if I'm a Christian, if I'm this, it's part of my religious credence, it's part of my dogmatic identity. If I go against this, then I'm breaking my group identity norms. Am I actually a carnivore? If I ate a blueberry, if I ate a chocolate chip by accident, whoops. Yeah. And that's can lead us to orthorexia. Like, I totally can appreciate that. So will you kick this off with like explaining the role of the amygdala and our brain's response to fear and stress? Obviously, we can keep it layman's terms. And specifically, how does the amygdala hijack or affect our decision-making behavior? And do you have any strategies that we could use to manage this in response more effectively in our daily lives?
Yeah. So really the amygdala is part of the limbic system, and it's sort of like the ancient brain, right? And so it's involved in things like detecting threats, triggering a body response, like you pull your hand off a hot stove, or fear conditioning, like being afraid to drive after you get in a car accident or something, processing positive emotions, encoding emotional memories. It even stores long-term memory, including emotional trauma. So the amygdala is really, I try to think of it as, it's responsible for the famous fight or flight response. But I like to think of it as something that's actually trying to protect us from either an emotional stress or from a physical threat. This is really key for the audience. But the problem is, back in the day, perhaps maybe the only threats we were under were truly life-threatening, like from a saber-toothed tiger attack or something like that, right? Our brain wasn't developed with the concept of emotional stress, like if your boss is angry at you, or if something's not going well in your life, you're having financial stress, right? So this is the problem. The amygdala can actually overtake the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe of your brain is where your logic and reasoning occurs. And so sometimes the amygdala can actually peek over, so to speak, the frontal lobe, because it wants to recognize a scenario and see if it can save us or protect us from emotional distress or some physical harm. So it's not a bad thing that we have the amygdala. In fact, we probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the amygdala. Again, I always say, like, if the saber-toothed tiger is attacking you, you don't want your frontal lobe to go, I wonder what his intentions are. The amygdala just says, get up, go. It liberates blood sugar. It gets blood flowing to the extremities. It's time to go. We've probably all felt that intense feeling at times. And that's when the amygdala takes over. But unfortunately, in modern times, as you can imagine, every time we are stressed out about something, that is when the amygdala hijack becomes problematic because it disables that frontal lobe. In fact, there was a paper from 2016 that suggested an inverse relationship between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. For instance, when the amygdala is activated, prefrontal cortex is less activated. So when emotions run high, the blood and oxygen flow to the amygdala rather than the prefrontal cortex, reducing our ability to think and solve problems. So now you can see how, one, people could leverage that fear if they want you to become more malleable in your thinking, but how also we could potentially sabotage ourselves by surrounding ourselves in fear, whether it's the media that we consume or the people that we hang out with. If we're in a constant state of fear, we're going to be much less likely to make rational, logical decisions about any particular topic. And then I think, to your point, that also makes us more likely to go with the flow, because that's also a survival mechanism, right? If we were in a big tribe once upon a time, if everybody wanted to go one direction and you said, no, I think I want to go this direction, most likely your lineage wouldn't have survived because you would have been all alone, and survival was dependent on the pack once upon a time. Yet another thing that I think we have outlived its usefulness, and now it can be used against us because that pack mentality keeps us doing things that very often are not good for us as an individual, but it's a mechanism that's programmed so deeply that it's hard to unravel.
Yeah. And I mean, we see this play out so many times throughout society. It's not just recently. This is something we see in cyclical action time and time again. It's only recently now that we have the technology and the ability to study and try to put some words to some of these concepts. We're still learning more every day. The book you recommended, Emotional Intelligence, was recently updated, I think, for 25-year anniversary, right? So that was cool. The updated version I'm reading. So I thought that was really neat. Whenever you have a book that's been updated, that they can explore how much their original topics have advanced or developed, what are some strategies that we can notice when we're feeling that surge, right? So we can get that really easily on social media, right? Watching someone's stories. But we do need to understand the initial reactions, like the sweaty palms, perhaps the elevated heart rate, and then what? Then what? Because I think that's the hard part, is folks don't even realize they're in that conditioning response, right?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. And I think from all the research I've done, really, there is no great answer. And it's incredibly difficult because you are fighting your biology, and you're fighting years and years of evolutionary biology that said, it's better for us to be overly consumed with this stress response to get us out of danger. But again, they call it an evolutionary mismatch, because now we have no need for that chronic, intense stress response, because now our stress, unfortunately, is all around us. So it's very difficult. So I want to just tell your audience, this is something that actually takes practice, but you actually hit on the very first thing that I would recommend, which is awareness. Just being aware that you are in one of these situations, like just listening to this podcast, automatically you are now armed with the knowledge that, so my reasoning and my emotions are literally in opposition to each other, and they can't coexist at the same level. So that's really important. So I tell people, listen, stop what you're doing. Breathe, right? You can do breath work like box breathing or parasympathetic breathing that can shift your autonomic nervous system. That's really important. That can actually help restore some oxygen and blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. And you only need a moment to be able to realize what's going on. I tell people, when it comes to nutrition, we all know people probably who eat out of boredom or eat out of any other reason besides hunger. And very often I'll just say, I just want you to stop. I want you to stop and ask yourself if you're hungry. Assess the scenario around you. Are you hungry for some snacky chip kind of food, or are you really hungry for a meal? Do you want to dig into, some steak and some vegetables and some bone broth? And are you really that hungry, or do you just want the Snickers bar, right? That's a difference. And very often you can stop that hijack by just taking a moment. And then again, getting curious and asking questions, talk to yourself. Don't be afraid to talk to yourself in the third person. Okay, Jay, what's happening in this scenario? Why do I feel the sweaty palms and the heart rate? Am I actually in danger? I remember when I first started social media, and I came to social media kicking and screaming. I just didn't want to do it, but people kept telling me, if you want to get the message out there, this is the place to do it. So I did it. But then very early on, you start to get comments and people that are pushing back against you. And I had really not developed the skills to be able to handle that. And so it upset me. It honestly, it really did. And I didn't, because I like to make people happy. That my career as an entertainer is like, nobody leaves my performance mad at me, and that doesn't happen. Now, all of a sudden, people are angry at me and they think I'm, trying to force something on people. And I'm like, this is uncharted waters for me. And I had that response where I would be like, and I could feel it, like when I would want to type out a response and I would say, okay, Jay, you need to take 20 minutes away from this comment and you'll go back and talk about it later when you can be more rational. But that was such a clear line of delineation for me when it came to whether I was acting logically or whether I was acting out of pure emotion. And I think probably the audience can see themselves in that moment and think of something in their lives where they go, I'm just responding to something. I've said something to this person that I didn't intend to say because they made me mad. And if I had thought about it, I definitely wouldn't have said that thing. I think we've all probably been there.
Hey there, I wanted to pause the interview really quick because I have some practical tips that I have to include right here. I'm reading the book Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, written by Pete Walker. And in chapter 8, he specifically mentions practical tips on how to manage these emotional hijacks. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is perfect for a lot of us coming out of high control environments or recovering from the intense experience of religious and spiritual trauma. So first, I want to go over how to recognize that you're in one of these emotional flashbacks. We just spoke of how awareness is the key to any sort of behavior change. Here are some specific signs to look out for. Number 1, you're feeling overwhelming fear or panic, sudden intense anxiety without clear cause in the present moment, as if you're in imminent danger. 2, feeling small or helpless. You may feel like you've been reverted to a childlike state, experiencing a sense of powerlessness or vulnerability. 3, your inner critic might become louder, filling your mind with harsh, negative self-talk, critical thoughts such as I'm not good enough or I can't handle this. 4, you'll feel a sense of doom or despair, maybe a pervasive feeling of hopelessness or believing that the situation will never improve can dominate your thoughts. 6, intense shame or guilt. You might experience a sudden wave of shame, feeling as though you're fundamentally flawed or bad. 6, emotional numbness or dissociation. You may feel disconnected from your emotions, body, or surrounding, as if you're watching yourself from the outside. Couple more here. Physical symptoms you might notice like your racing heart, shallow breathing, sweating, or feeling frozen in place. 8, you might feel this urgent need to escape or hide or isolate or avoid others. And this is just driven because you want to feel safe. Number 9, you might be really sensitive to criticism, like anything that might be perceived as rejection. You will react strongly to these things that might not normally bother you. You might feel overwhelmed by simple tasks, like even routine things that you were used to doing now feel insurmountable. This might lead to procrastination or avoidance, and you'll have flashbacks or intrusive memories, like really vivid images from the past traumatic experiences may surface, which will blur the lines between past and present. Last 2, excessive people-pleasing or compliance. You may find yourself excessively trying to please others or agreeing to things that you normally wouldn't out of fear of conflict or abandonment. And last one, avoidance of eye contact or social interactions. So you may avoid looking people in the eyes or withdrawing completely from social situations. And this comes from a strong need to hide, which is signs of all being in an emotional flashback. So I don't know about you guys, but I relate to every single one of those. For example, I've been on interviews here and I have gone into a complete fawning response where they'll go into some of the anti-racism, system of whiteness, topics that, we're not talking about today on this podcast because Jay is not a part of some of that radicalization of the left, thank goodness. But I would just go in a complete fawning mode. And looking back and editing it, I would almost feel sick to my stomach and be like, who the fuck is that? And learning more about CPSD and learning more about fawning, it just makes so much sense. And that leads me directly to the 13 tips that Peter Walker mentions in the Managing Emotional Flashbacks in the book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. So number 1, say to yourself, I am having a flashback. Acknowledge that you are in a flashback and recognize that these intense feelings come from the past. 2, remind yourself, I feel afraid, but I'm not in danger. Assure yourself that although fear is absolutely real, it is not about something that's happening now. 3, own your right to need boundaries, recognizing that it's okay to set boundaries with others, even if it feels very uncomfortable. Deconstruct eternity thinking, understanding that the flashback will pass and these feelings are temporary, not eternal. Number 5, remind yourself, I am in the body of an adult and I have choices. Here you are reaffirming your ability to make choices and take action as an adult, unlike when you were a child. 6, ease back into your body. I think this is something that I absolutely have to focus on personally. Grounding yourself physically by engaging in sensory activities like deep breathing, walking, self-hugging. I also ordered those calm strips. I'm sure you've seen an ad on Instagram. I like it. I think it's great. Number 7, seek support. Reach out to trusted friends, a therapist, or support group who can provide understanding and help you navigate the flashback. I personally lack this sort of support, and I truly hope that this podcast is becoming a support pipeline for all of us who are navigating this crazy shit. Number 9, practice self-compassion. And I haven't talked a lot about the work from Kristin Neff. I did write a book report and a blog about that. I'll link it in the show notes. But we really need to learn how to treat ourselves with kindness and understanding, talking to ourselves like we would talk to a friend, recognizing the pain and fear that happened from the flashback. Last couple here. Thanks for hanging in there. Challenge your inner critic. Actively dispute the negative thoughts and beliefs that arise from your inner critic during a flashback. Number 11, allow yourself to grieve. Permit yourself to feel and process the sadness and loss connected to the original trauma. 12, employ grounding techniques. Use techniques like focusing on the present moment, engaging with your senses, or repeating grounding phrases to stay anchored. Last one, cultivating safe relationships. Develop and nurture relationships that are supportive, trustworthy, and understanding of your experiences. And so I hope that these tips can help you feel and understand these intense emotional responses that we will have from past traumas that could shift us into these emotional hijacks, into the amygdala hijacking. It literally could be CPTSD, complex PTSD from our childhoods. And it is complex, just as Jay was saying, and I just wanted to provide a little bit more practical tips. Please check out the show notes if you want to have reference to these. It is stated in the book that individuals that printed out these 13 tips and became extremely familiar with them progressed faster in recovering from their complex PTSD symptoms. Alrighty, back to the interview. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm walking that fine line myself, trying to navigate the deconstruction space. And some days I'm sassier than others. On my other page, Taste of Truth, not on Making Me Fit, I don't really bring it over there too much. Given your expertise in clinical nutrition and how much our diet and nutrition can impact the function of our limbic system, for me, like my one of my good friends that I work with in functional dietetics, she was helping me understand like my calcium and magnesium were just genuinely really low. And so it was like, no wonder I'm like, if I'll have, those are going to help me feeling more relaxed. And so if I'm not getting those nutrients, issue with some of my cellular wall, cellular metabolism stuff, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this. So are there specific foods or nutrients or some elements there that you could recommend that could help us support the concept of emotional regulation and maybe reduce this likelihood of that hijack during stressful situations?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And let me just add one last thing. There's also, I missed it in my notes, found a really cool study from 2018 that actually showed meditation. Researchers discovered that long-term meditators had reduced amygdala activation when they were showed images designed to invoke negative feelings. So now, I am not a meditator. I wish I was. I cannot quiet my brain down. And I know people say, you just got to work through that. And I do. But how cool is that that's another indication that the amygdala is within our control. It just might be more challenging. So I just wanted to add that before jumping into the next thing. So nutrients. So I think, as I was exploring this a little bit, because you sent me some of these questions ahead of time, and I was like, that's a really good question. And I don't know the answer other than to say that every time I started to dig into the literature, I kept coming back to blood sugar levels. And so I just wanted to read a couple of quotes because I think this is like all encompassing, because this relates to just diet in general. And I always tell people, you don't have to subscribe to a specific dogma. What I care about is that whatever nutrition strategy you're implementing, that it's doing certain things, keeping inflammation down, controlling blood sugar. There are a few other things that I really look for. But many people that do rely primarily on carbohydrates, and from a biological perspective, carbohydrates are non-essential. I know people get weird when I say that, but truly we can create carbohydrate or glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So there's a reason for that, right? So maybe that meant that once upon a time, glucose was very scarce. And so the body needed to survive this adaptation of gluconeogenesis to create carbohydrate or glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. But generally speaking, if your diet is jacking up your blood sugar and causing then causing massive amounts of insulin to be secreted, causing hyperinsulinemia, and then blood sugar lows. That kind of diet long-term is going to be problematic. And so when I researched this, I found things like the hippocampus, which is also part of the limbic system along with the amygdala, is particularly vulnerable to elevated blood sugar levels. And of course, that also plays a role in memory and emotion, reproductive issues. In the Journal of Diabetes in 2018, this was very interesting. This paper stated, we have found that amygdala neurons express something called CFOS, which is a marker of neuronal activation in responses to changes in blood glucose. So, and it seems that it's hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, and hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. So it seems that the amygdala sees both of those scenarios as a potential for danger, which makes perfect sense. That's what I came across in the research, was blood sugar had a very serious correlation with amygdala activity.
Thank you so much for all of that. That's really, really insightful. And so one thing I want to touch on was a meditation comment, because in fundamentalist Christianity, they're really, really dogmatic against meditation. They say it's demonic. They say and I find that insanely curious. Wonder why? And so, my dietitian, I don't know if you know who she is. Her handle is Chew Foods Wisely. Her name's Nicole. She's a functional integrative dietitian.
Okay.
Right up your alley. You'd love her. So she does the BRAIN method, so it's an acronym: blood sugar balance, regulate inflammation, adrenal resiliency, intestinal support, and nutrition replenishing.
Yeah.
And so she's really passionate about that too. And, and that's where I love your tidbit about, carbohydrates being non-essential. And I completely agree with that. But what the tidbit I like to add is they are protein sparing, right? And so consuming carbohydrates can help prevent the breakdown of muscle mass, which is how we get like proteins made from gluconeogenesis in a way, right?
Yep.
And if we're talking about blood sugar balance, sometimes people who have low blood sugar, like what would you recommend for folks if we're going to talk about blood sugar balance? What would be some like really quick nutritional interventions to navigate that? Because sometimes people grab and go food. They might not be grabbing and going with the best food choices, right?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think ultimately what I would like to see long term, because short term, if there's a blood sugar emergency, rescuing that quickly is important. But the problem I see with that is if this is a cyclical thing and it's happening constantly, then you're going to have a real problem. So what I would love to do with most people, and I recommend this, is, it's like a cliche, but becoming metabolically flexible. So because what's also protein sparing are ketones, which is a byproduct of fatty acid metabolism. So I like to see the ability to utilize fat as a fuel. Now this comes from an athletic perspective, because my first introduction to this was Jeff Volek, who wrote the book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance, which is an amazing book. It's really a short read, but it really explains fuel partitioning and really explains that if you can adapt an athlete for 6 months, 8 months, depends on the athlete, it can take. But once you measure ketones in the blood and you understand the body is now utilizing them, and I've experienced this, all of a sudden, now you can still utilize glucose. So when I would run races, I would eat glucose, I would eat something in the morning, carbohydrate rich. But then once that fuel burned out, instead of hitting the wall or having a low blood sugar episode, immediately fatty acid metabolism, beta oxidation kicked up. And then I was able to mobilize fat. So I never experienced that there was seamless energy for me. So for blood sugar regulation, ironically, I think one of the best things you can do is train your body to mobilize fat as a fuel source, which is like if you picture metabolism as a fire, the carbohydrates are that kindling that you put on the fire that burn really quickly, or the fats are like the logs that burn for a longer period of time, and they can help stabilize that system. Now, it doesn't mean that you won't be able to use glucose. Like I said, it just means you have an additional fuel source. So if you think of it from an athletic perspective, you're at quite the advantage because you can use both of those. So that's really what I would say is that at first it's hard because we are reliant on carbohydrates in society today. They put them at the base of the food pyramid, for crying out loud in the 70s. So yeah, it's like grains and pastas and breads. You got to eat more of those than anything else, which is really wild when you understand the biology. And if you go back to people like E.V. McCollum in the early 1900s, who was an amazing biochemist, and this was before there are money interests and other interests other than just pure science, which is always why I like to reference him as like the OG of nutrition science. I have his book, Newer Knowledge of Nutrition. I think he wrote it in like 1912 or 1918 or something. And it's just fantastic, just full of like straight up science. And again, it was before industry sort of impacted that. So, and it's a long-winded answer, but I think really real whole foods and And obviously, and periods of fasting, which could evenly just mean like after your last meal of the day, you don't have any snacks and you just have your breakfast in the morning, even if that's like 10 to 12 hours, right? That's enough to get you starting to utilize fats. Then for the breakfast meal, I usually recommend fats and proteins at that first meal of the day, and then maybe carbohydrates like later on in the day after you've been active, after your body is a little bit more primed, especially after a workout, after your body's more primed to accept them. But that's the best way, I think, to manage blood sugar and keep it stable, and also your amygdala stay nice and calm.
I would like to pause the interview and touch base on a couple comments that Jay just said. So the Art and Science of Low Carb Performance book he mentioned, the research was specifically done on male participants. And I think it's really important that we take note on that because female physiology is very different than male physiology when it comes to low carb dieting and the benefits of intermittent fasting. As of 2024, many nutrition and fitness studies still underrepresent women despite growing awareness in this issue. One prime example is many early studies on cardiovascular health were done on men, and as a result, women were often treated based on these findings, leading to a very large difference in the recognition and treatment of heart disease. For instance, symptoms of a heart attack can present very differently in women compared to men, and the treatments are going to be different. But what's pertinent about this conversation here is women have different metabolic responses to dietary changes due to hormonal differences, which will impact how we lose weight and how we manage blood sugar levels. The last thing I must add is if you are a woman, adding intermittent fasting on top of exercise can actually be harmful to both your performance and your health. So often we focus on eating too much that we fail to understand the negative implications of eating too little. 1,200 to 1,500 calories is considered a hypocaloric diet, meaning your body needs to burn fat as a supplement to the energy that you get from food. And so this is an issue I see with a lot of my clients. So I really appreciate the information that Jay is suggesting here. But from my personal experience with my clients, most of them are actually under eating, and we do not need to implement keto diets or intermittent fasting. We actually need to focus on mastering the basics first. I found that many of my female clients are chronically underfed because of number one, afraid to eat. Number two, they've been chronic dieters in the past. And three, they genuinely don't realize how much energy and nutrition they need. In a recent review of 42 studies published between 2013 and 2020, examined the effects of deficit in total calories, proteins, and vitamins and minerals on performance. They found that not only were women more likely to be deficient in these key nutrients, but also between 30 and 70% of the women in the studies were energy deficient. Low energy availability is extremely common in female athletes. Another 2019 survey of 1,000 female athletes across more than 40 sports published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine estimated the risk of low energy availability in female athletes is more than 47%. Nearly half the performance-minded women may not be eating enough for their body to perform basic functions like creating muscle, regulating metabolism, and maintaining homeostasis after accounting for the energy they use for training. So diets such as intermittent fasting and keto disrupt kisspeptin production, and women are more sensitive to kisspeptin, a neuropeptide that's responsible for sex hormones and endocrine reproductive function. So adding exercise to the equation just adds to the stress of denying our body's important fuel sources. Our thyroid activity is depressed as a result, which will mess with our menstrual cycle. So the long-term effects of intermittent fasting with exercise for female athletes is endocrine dysfunction, increase in the abdominal fat, more prone to depression, and subsequent fat regain. Pretty much the opposite direction of your goals. So I think back on before I truly grasped this concept, not only was I practicing intermittent fasting days, I was also doing fasted workouts, fasted cardio, I was chronically under-eating and overtraining in general. Never again. There's actually a long list of people who should potentially avoid intermittent fasting. Anyone with a history of eating disorders or disordered eating, people with hypothyroid, women trying to get pregnant or breastfeeding, highly stressed individuals, if you have an autoimmune disorder, women with PCOS, if you have diabetes, if you're missing your menstruation cycle, or if you're trying to put on muscles. Instead of restricting and under-eating, that's going to make it worse. I'd like for you to try this instead. Learn how to support your adrenals and thyroid by eating protein, carbs, and fat every 3 to 4 hours. Focus on the right types of fat: ghee, butter, tallow, coconut oil, MCT oil, dairy fats. Jay has mentioned McCullum, an early 20th century nutrition researcher, and he's best known for his work on vitamins and their role in the human health. He was very much focused on vitamins A, B, C, and D. In this research, it's noted that deficiencies in vitamins and minerals can sometimes be exacerbated by diets high in refined grains. So last couple tips here, make sure that you are focusing on taking deep breaths throughout the day and learn more ways to activate your vagus nerve and get those minerals in. Focus on potassium, magnesium in particular. And guess what, guys? Exercising can induce autophagy, and I think that's a much more sustainable approach than practicing intermittent fasting. When women do not get enough complex carbs, we will see a shift in serotonin levels, a shift in progesterone, and a shift in insulin metabolism. These hormonal changes can cause problems like acne or worsen existing conditions like endometriosis or PCOS. So women who are in perimenopause or menopause, this can increase cortisol and estrogen and can make your symptoms worse. Before getting back to the interview, I just want to close down this rant by saying that we are all unique snowflakes and many factors go into your daily nutrition needs. So it's really important to hire a professional to work with somebody when you're trying to determine your metabolic identity, tune into your biofeedback, which is like hunger, craving, self-talk, monthly cycles, sleep, recovery, energy, stress, stuff like that, and how to optimize your meals, your snacks, and your habits from there. Make sure you are not following a cookie cutter meal plan or diet. It has to be individualized to you, your body, and your lifestyle. Yeah, really, really well said. And I really appreciate that insight. And so before we move on, I think something that I'd like to ask for my own personal journey coming from the bodybuilding community, which is so much against fat, as you probably know. Yeah. When I competed, I did 4 competitions in like 2.5 years, which was because I didn't have a good coach and I just wrecked my metabolic function. And I tried for 2 years naturally, but I ended up going on T4 meds, which was actually really helpful. And now I'm hoping to get off them at some point in the future. But yeah, so I feel like I really negatively impacted my metabolic flexibility with that. And so at one point in my second competition, I was down to eating about 18 grams of fat per day, and then like literally eating maybe 25 grams of carbs. So I was literally eating like no energy substrates at all. And then the problem was with that coaching program, I did not reverse diet at all. Like they just dropped me after my competition. And so I OD'd on fat multiple times. One time I made these avocado fudge brownies and I ate so many of them. I was physically ill on a couch for 6 to 7 hours, could not move. And my roommate was concerned about me. I was like, I literally just ate too much fat. I'm physically sick. I tried to go to the gym and walk it off to try to help my body process. And so before we move on, I didn't prepare you for this one, but could you help me with just a little bit of insights on some of the negative metabolic impacts of that? And it's okay that happened because bodybuilders condition us to do that. And any insights, because I'm sure people can relate from diet culture. It's very much anti-fat. And we are going to talk about that a little bit later on. So it's not completely off topic.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the most dangerous, we have to first understand that bodybuilding is an amazing achievement, but it's not synonymous with health. So it's like one or the other. And I've talked to on my show that I do with Daryl, she formerly competed, I think she only did one competition, but she was wrecked afterwards as well. And so, and especially for females to go low fat is very dangerous when you think about how hormonally driven the female body is. To restrict fat is dangerous. And things like cholesterol make the backbone of all the sex hormones, right? So I can see why that would be, incredibly dangerous, for a female. But the same thing happens to a male. And what's interesting though is I was working with somebody relatively recently who was doing a bodybuilding competition, a female, and I was trying to get her more to fat metabolism because I think, and again, this is not my field, so maybe people would be like, well, this is why that's not true. But I would say having the ability to burn your own body fat would be beneficial for someone bodybuilding, because once you flip that metabolic switch, then, you're already going hypocaloric, I'm assuming, for a bodybuilding, right? So fasting might be a less detrimental way to achieve the same body composition rather than this chronic hypocaloric diet, which can result in a drop in BMR and all those things, which fasting tends not to do. So that's the difference between the two. And I would, I just always think the answer, because I think that's our ancestral fuel, is to have the body have the ability to use fat, because then you can either eat it or you can use your own, mobilize your own body fat. And for your situation after, I bet your low fat diet contributed to probably a very sluggish gallbladder, probably not a lot of bile, which really inhibits fat digestion. And that probably just put you into this really uncomfortable state from a GI perspective. But I bet your gallbladder was just like, wait a minute, we haven't eaten fat in, who knows how many months. Now all of a sudden you want to dump, 200 grams. So I bet that was probably what you were suffering from. I would have said to you, get some digestive enzymes, specifically ones that have lipase in them, to be able to break that cycle and get your body used to metabolizing fat again.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's like when you get so stuck in the dogmatic beliefs and my worth was so tied to that, I wasn't even thinking kindly to myself. It's so much about how you look, and it's really wild. So that does take us into the next question, talking about food as a hormone, because, we were just talking about fat and the intake of fat, how important it is for females and our fertility. I do have a post about these concept of really lean body types destroying our fertility. And I was when I looked at the data, it's 26 to 28% body fat is what's required for healthy ovulation. I'm that is literally almost obese technically in fitness terms. And that goes completely against everything that I was taught in the fitness industry. And so I had to redo my entire, I am now the healthiest I've been, because I'm working towards that, but that definitely involved gaining some body fat compared to where I was, which was mind blowing and hard for females to understand or to wrap their brain around. So, you talk about, and I will link all these posts and stuff that I'm referencing, guys, in the show notes, a growing body of evidence. You mentioned that how suggests food components act like hormones, affecting cell signaling and gene transcription. So how does this perspective shift our understanding of nutrition and its role in health and disease management? And can you specifically elaborate on the significance of branched-chain amino acids and the omega-3 fatty acids in these processes? Because I think that's something I would love to have you talk more on, is seed oils and healthy fats and that sort of thing on another subject. But yeah.
Oh boy, yeah. That's such a great question. So yes, I want to shift. If I was, nutrition czar for a day, I would want people to shift their way of thinking from, first of all, from calories, which, are sort of ethereal. I'm not even sure what they mean to the body, but it's, again, on this podcast that I did earlier today, I was talking about mitochondria, and I was going through some of these nutrients. And when you really understand, and if people are interested, you can go to my Rumble channel and watch. I have a 2-part video on the mitochondria. One is the biochemistry of energy production, and the other half is 15 minutes each. The other half, 15 minutes, is how it applies to your everyday life. And I think that's valuable for people to check out, because when you learn, again, that the mitochondria needs certain nutrients to generate energy, you just look at food differently, because you look at it in terms of what kind of nutrients can it supply. So things like the branched-chain amino acid leucine, that is the trigger for muscle protein synthesis, the mTOR pathway. Now, it also regulates cell cycle, progression, growth, insulin action, all those things. But a lot of people in the longevity community will tell you leucine is dangerous because mTOR is dangerous because it creates growth. But if you think about it, like everything in nature, there's just a balance. You can't have no growth, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? So it's interesting to me that they always want to reduce these arguments to their sort of lowest common denominator. And I'm just not really into that. I think that if you look at our, what you said before too, if we look at our traditional roles in ancestral living, a higher body fat percentage would have been perfectly normal for a female. It would have been completely normal. We have no concept of what our roles were traditionally, because now we've assumed all these new roles that our bodies are not really necessarily accustomed to. There's no such thing as bodybuilding in the ancestral community. It's just our ancestors didn't bodybuild. Their exercise was hunting and gathering and protection, from animals. So that's just a side note for that. I think that's so interesting, and I agree with you. We've lost track of what actually a healthy body looks like, and a healthy body makes sense, would have some fat on it because you need that fat for survival. What if you're pregnant and all of a sudden there's a famine and there's no, the hunt is unsuccessful and you're in the winter and there's not a lot to be gathered? The female body needs that onboard fat to sustain the life of the fetus and the life of the mother. So I know it's not the thing that's going to put you maybe on the cover of, the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated, but who really wants that anyway? I'd rather have people be healthy and thriving. So that's the branched-chain amino acid leucine. That's the perfect example of why I advocate for animal proteins, because they're different than plant proteins. It's not that plant proteins are, okay, let's see, how do I say this in a very, I want to be judicious about this. So plant proteins are inferior, but it doesn't mean that they don't have their place in the diet. they don't have the same bioavailability, and there are a variety of reasons. You can go into like really nerdy stuff like the secondary structure of protein of animals and plant protein. They differ in their secondary structure, which makes them less bioavailable to the body's breakdown systems, which is super cool when you think about when people say, oh, animal protein is king. It's true. And these are some of the reasons why. Plant proteins tend to also not be complete proteins. So you need to mix and match in order to get the wide array of amino acids. And those amino acids are important for everything, not just muscle building, but the immune system and mitochondrial function and everything. So amino acids are key. That's why I prioritize animal protein. If you talk about something like omega-3s, like you mentioned, seed oils, you'll see a lot of information out there that says seed oils aren't harmful. I think that they're misunderstanding the ultimate point, which is something called the omega-6 to 3 ratio. And that's really what I focus on, because that's a ratio that determines like systemic inflammation, let's say, like from a high level. Omega-6 tends to elongate into pro-inflammatory mediators, which again, that's not a bad thing. Remember, pro-inflammatory mediators are useful for healing. If we cut ourselves, you bet your butt we want to be able to inflame to be able to heal the body. But the omega-3s elongate into anti-inflammatory mediators, and they are there to help finish off the process and quell the inflammation, right? So it's this beautiful balance. And indeed, as we have learned, that our hunter-gatherer ancestors had a omega-6 to 3 ratio of 1-to-1, or at the highest, maybe 4-to-1, right? So it's very, very balanced. In modern society, because of things like seed oils, we are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30-to-1 in terms of omega-6 to 3. So that pushes us into that pro-inflammatory chronic state. And if you think about it, when I do blood work on people, I see levels of C-reactive protein very high almost all the time, because we are in a chronically inflamed state. So those signaling molecules in the food are really important. So you can't break down omega-6 seed oils into just calories, because they may be the exact same amount of calories as something that you would eat like salmon that's high in omega-3, but they have a very different impact in the body in terms of inflammation. So really, I know it's a lot to take in and a lot to learn, but it's so beneficial for us to understand how these foods impact us. And it's not just all protein is protein, all fat is 9 calories per gram, all protein and carbohydrate are 4 calories per gram, and it's that simple. It is way more complicated than that, I think. And we would do ourselves a service if we would start to think of food that way.
Yeah. I completely agree through and through. I saw that when I was, getting my degree in dietetics. I saw that they were promoting high fructose corn syrup. I was seeing the lobbyism clear as day, and it was very, very alarming. I mean, I got Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, that book back in the day that was reviewing some of this stuff. And I was like, this is like, so many folks want to bash it, but I'm like, this book is reviewing legal evidence that was presented against the FDA. Like, this is not a conspiracy theory. If it's presented in court and accepted as court evidence, it doesn't get any more like truthful than that in our made up society. Okay. So wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm picking up on everything you're putting down. I think that's part of like why I like to talk about conspiracy theories, is because there's some that are completely absolutely ludicrous. Like, gravity's not real and we live in a dome. And then there's other things about like the FDA and the, lobbyism that's going on, and how money has really driven some of these directions in nutritional sciences. And that's stuff that we really have to talk about. And you courageously talk about that a lot. And we'll get to that in a bit. And that's kind of where we're shifting now, is like the future of dietary guidelines. I mean, I saw that in dietetics. That's why, I'm kind of regretful that I didn't do the 1-year unpaid dietetic internship and afford that. I wanted to get out of Virginia as fast as humanly possible. So I just moved to Portland, Oregon, told my parents I was going to apply to OHSU and try to get my master's out there. But I had a 2.8 GPA and I knew I wouldn't get accepted. And I just tried to become a professional hula hooper. But I really thought, I was like, why I didn't want to go there is I thought there was no way I could be a dietitian and not practice under the dogma. And now I see so many folks that you and I know, a lot of them. Michelle was one of them. There's so many that are RDs, but are also thinking outside the box. And, I don't woulda, coulda, shoulda in the decisions that I made for my career choices. But, that's why I didn't want to become a dietitian. I was like, I don't want to wear that label proudly. It seems so dogmatic and not even, and how much, I don't know if you know how much the Seventh Day Adventism has influenced nutritional guidelines, but holy cannoli, that's a whole nother thing that we could talk about. So considering this view of everything we're talking about, that food can act as signaling molecules. So how do you think this could impact our approach to dietary recommendations and nutritional guidelines? Like, like you already mentioned a little bit, if you could be the nutrition, like, king of the day, you would say, what would be more moves that you would want to see here based on this biochemical understanding?
So, I mean, my answer is again, to go back to people like Evie McCollum and the biochemists of the day. And there was an awesome paper published in Frontiers in Nutrition, I think in 2022, is called Priority Micronutrient Density in Foods. And it's one of my favorite papers because they just break it down to in order to get to the RDA, we're going to assume the RDA is fine. I don't think the RDA is fine in terms of recommended daily allowance of certain vitamins and minerals, but let's just use that as a guidepost, because that's the argument people will make, is that, oh, well, these foods can get you there. Well, what they found out was that, in the top 10 foods, other than leafy greens, every single one of them was an animal food to get you to the recommended daily amounts of certain micronutrients. And it was just so obvious to see that we've prioritized the complete, like they always say, flip the food pyramid upside down. We have literally prioritized the wrong foods since the 1970s. And with the introduction of seed oils back in the, early, 1911, I think Crisco was invented. The year before that was the Flexner Report, when the Rockefeller Foundation basically took over medical schools, and we started to indoctrinate doctors and healthcare professionals in this idea that man-made products are superior because we have somehow in our intellectual genius understood that humans are deficient in this, this, and this. And if we can just supplement them with this, this, and this, they'll be fine. At the same time, telling you that all the foods that are natural, like butter and red meat and all these things, right, and eggs are somehow bad for you, even though we've been consuming them since the dawn of time. It's really shocking when you think about it. And so in terms of the dietary guidelines, I got to be honest with you, I think we should do away with the dietary guidelines, because I think they've done no good for anybody. If you understand the way they were constructed, I did a presentation in Tennessee last year where I drew a straight line from Ellen Gould White, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the dietary guideline interventions in 1977, a direct line with maybe 5 or 6 different people. There's a direct line to Ellen Gould White, to those dietary guidelines in the Seventh-day Adventists. And just for people who don't know, the Seventh-day Adventists are very much against animal products for a variety of reasons. And people like John Harvey Kellogg were involved in that whole process. And so I don't know what the answer is, to fix the problem. I think I would just like to see maybe a set of recommendations are fine, but the problem with food dietary guidelines is that they impact what we serve in hospitals. So I saw that firsthand. They impact what the military are fed. They impact schools. They impact what food programs, for underprivileged communities, what they're allowed to buy with them. And I think that's also leading to the ill health of these people. If they can use their SNAP or their WIC or their food discounts on Coca-Cola, but not on, salmon or a grass-fed steak or veggies, that's a serious problem. So we're not prioritizing the right foods. And, just to tell people, when I tried to speak before the Dietary Guidelines Committee this year, I applied and I sent in my whole thing, and they denied me. They wouldn't let me speak before the committee. And that's not a surprise, because in my sort of thesis, I said, I think we need to go back to people like Evie McCollum, look at real foods, what they provide to the body, and just leave it at that. We need to stop telling people that they should be eating low-fat diets, which are completely unnatural. We should stop telling people dietary dogma, and we should start dealing with the science. And of course, they wanted no part of me.
Yeah, unfortunately. But hey, you were doing what you can only ask yourself, hey, I did everything I could. I'm literally trying to put my hat in the ring and get up and talk and make moves and be the mover and shaker where we need to go. And, it's just all about not giving up too, right? And then, having your podcast, having your Substack, I will post the mitochondrial 2-part video series that you referenced on Rumble in the show notes, because I'm going to go watch those. I didn't even know about, I legit cellular nutrition and the mitochondria gets me so fucking hyped. I dressed as a hemoglobin for Halloween one year, and I could have the hula hoop, artists. I put hula hoops around me for the globe, and I had FE on my shirt, but it was a terrible idea because I could not fit at the apartment for the hotel, at the party, I was a really big molecule. So it was really awkward. If I felt like me, what's that blueberry woman from the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? It's
Yes,
that was
yes.
me. And then another time I tried to make a lipid bilayer out of balloons because I love fat metabolism so much. And I just love building. Oh yeah. So I tried, but like, it just couldn't work. Cause I'm in the circus and I love costuming and being creative. So,
Yeah,
biochem nerds for life. And
that's amazing.
we'll finish up the conversation with talking about this maintaining objectivity in nutritional science, because that has literally been kind of the underlying current of this entire conversation. And so we've discussed how, in your view, you think it's really important for researchers in the field of nutrition to, focus on the science, which is the science is almost like a mindset too, which is maintaining objectivity and avoid becoming dogmatic. And what we see a lot of is activism. I'll put up to a 2-part post you did on Instagram semi-recently, kind of talking about how activism, and like we were talking earlier about passion, can, put us into a bias or put us into a pigeonhole. And that's really, really not ideal if we're trying to maintain objectivity or intellectual humility. And so Gary Taubes is someone that you referenced. His research revealed this low-fat dietary guidelines were shaped by the complex interplay of politics, advocacy, and media. You, in your research, were talking about Seventh-day Advantism and how that's really influenced the Nutrition and Dietetics Association. And so we see this through and through. These are facts, not conspiracy theories. So, what do you think about this? What measures can we do that can be taken to maintain credibility? And is it possible to regain public trust in nutritional science? What in the kale? What do we do?
Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I always consider myself an idea guy. And I think one of the things and I think we mentioned this earlier, that transparency is a must. And wearing your biases, again, you have to stop pretending that science is some ethereal thing that isn't a method done by people, and people are fallible. So we always have to keep that in mind. Can we regain the trust? I think we could over time if public health improved. You have to understand, right? Like, the people that are listening to this might be asking, well, how do we know the dietary guidelines are terrible? Well, the Nutrition Coalition has done extensive research, and there have been several papers published in the last few years on the fact that Americans have followed the dietary guidelines. We adopted seed oils. We have significantly reduced red meat and saturated fat because we've been told those are the devil, right? So we've done all the things. We've increased grains. We've increased, all the foods that they told us to increase and all the foods they told us to decrease. And yet, obesity, type 2 diabetes, all these diseases are still running rampant, and they are known to be diseases of nutrition. You can find that in the literature. So my question is, if we're following the guidelines and the guidelines aren't leading to better health outcomes, we have to try something new. So I'm not in favor of new dietary guidelines. I just don't think, I think we did better before we had dietary guidelines. But now we're in this real predicament where most people, if you go out on the street, I say this all the time to people, find 10 people and ask and say, red meat, good or bad? I think 9 out of 10 would say bad, even though they have no real concept of why, right? So I think, and this was interesting, I lived in New York when they were trying to do that whole soda tax. They were trying to tax sodas. And at first, I was all for it because I was thinking, in the end, I want people to consume less soda because it's better for them. But I realized that anytime the government gets involved in nutrition, it's a bad thing. And so I adopted this new mentality of educate over legislate. I don't want the government to tell me what to eat, because you could have, the government right now is trying to tell you that red meat is destroying the planet and we have to, reduce red meat. So I think that's really important to say, let's educate the people. And when I show people that a diet, people go on a carnivore diet and have amazing experiences because it's essentially this massive elimination diet and they're having all these positive outcomes. And so I say, well, let's just connect the dots. If you feel fantastic on this, how would you feel if the government told you couldn't do this because it's bad for your health? And if they can't convince you that it's bad for your health, maybe it's bad for the environment or whatever. So I just have this thought that we need to educate people, because once they personally experience the benefits of proper nutrition, again, E.V. McCollum, I keep bringing up his name, but he's just such a fascinating character. He developed a list of protective foods. I might actually even be able to do it off the top of my head because he was such an influence on me. But it was meat, milk, fish, eggs, and leafy greens. Though that was his list of protective foods because they provided all of the nutrients necessary for all the processes in the body. And he said you should avoid things like milled grains, wheat, and food of low vitamin and mineral value. That's most of the processed foods that we're eating today. So I just feel like, in the end, education is going to be key. If we want to reclaim health, we want to figure out a way moving forward. As you said, we need to strip away, we need to understand where we went wrong with the dietary guidelines. We need to admit that they are not based in science and they are based on belief. And then we have to go back to the hard sciences of biochemistry and say, these foods provide this, these nutrient values. And when people have better health outcomes and the population gets healthier as a whole, I think it'll be a lot easier to convince people in several generations that we made a mistake and that the way going forward is to do things the way we had always done them, which is, again, to eat the foods that come from nature and not from a factory.
Yeah. And that's unfortunately like the climate change initiative is also trying to flip that on its head. And that's, the same phenomenon we're seeing where like fat got demonized. It's now, like you said, red meat people completely avoid, thinking cows are, horrible, and I'm really, really sad for that, especially veganism when it comes back to when we talked about females and their health and their vitality and their cycle. Veganism is the opposite of vitality and health for your cycle. And it's like a psyop. I genuinely think it's a psychological operation on mankind. But, to close down the conversation, like it's kind of similar, like when it comes to how do we help folks understand to be more critical when we're evaluating research that's talking about the environmental impacts of nutrition, because that's so much influenced by dogma right now.
I think the best thing you can do is expose yourself to as much, we tend to live in echo chambers. So try to expose yourself to as much information as you can. For example, I did a whole presentation on myths in nutrition, and climate was one of them. And, I pulled the EPA's own data from their website talking about agriculture, crop versus livestock, and that 50% of greenhouse gas emissions belong to crop, whereas only 44% are livestock. So crop agriculture is actually, if you care about greenhouse gases, they're actually more contributory to greenhouse gas emissions than livestock. So I thought that was fantastic. 70% of all the world's fresh water withdrawals go towards irrigating crops. So if you're worried about water, well, 70% of the fresh water withdrawals go to irrigating crops. So you pull this stuff off the EPA's own website, and all of a sudden it gives a different shape to the conversation. And what I hope is that people will start to just research. Like I said, I give these presentations, but there's plenty of other people that are trying to put good science out there. And consensus is only reached nowadays by silencing the scientists that don't go along with the narrative. That's what happened during COVID. People got dogmatic during COVID because it was really easy to minimize all of the scientists who were saying, hey, this is a very risk stratifiable disease. This is not the worldwide pandemic that we need to shut down the globe for. This has been blown out of proportion. There were plenty of people saying that very early on, but they got relegated to obscurity. And so in the media, and I guess maybe one of the other things I could tell people is you got to turn off the mainstream media. They are, I hate to say this and sound so hyperbolic because politicians say this, but they've become the enemy of the people because they are not doing what they were intended to do, which is be a check on power and provide unbiased truth to people. They are not doing that anymore. Politically, geopolitically, health, nutrition, anything. So you got to turn them off and you got to go out. We live in the information age. Utilize that. Go find sources of information that are going to be a check on your own information. In other words, put yourself in the uncomfortable position of saying, hey, maybe I don't think anything this person has to say is worth it, but I'm going to listen. I'm going to go look it up myself and I'm going to see what happens. You will be a better person because you will either be able to better articulate your position or you will be introduced to new information. So that's my biggest thing for people. Get out there. It's a big world. There's a lot of information. Don't stay comfortable in your little bubble. Go out there and look for new information. That's how it started for me. And I feel like I'm much more informed now that I am shutting off the mainstream media and doing most of the research for myself.
Yeah. I think that's really, really well said. And, mainstream media, we know Operation Mockingbird, there is, truth in some of the stuff. We do need to understand that, if there are journalists that are trying to do it right, their life is threatened or they are silenced as well. And so I appreciate that. We will definitely have you back on to break down some of these concepts and topics. Yeah. And I loved your comment on educate over legislate. That is interesting when we look at the cyclical aspects of history, like how things shake out. We always think we start off with a great idea and we might not see how it'll shake out. So we just have to be intellectually humble. And that also includes showing up and realizing we were coming from a less informed place.
Yeah.
And then being okay with that. That is just something that if we do it ourselves, individually, if you do it, I do it, then we'll have a ripple impact and we encourage other folks to do it. That's about the only way I cannot lose cynicism in society right now. And knowing that there's folks out there like you. So I will link all this information and some of the sources that you shared. Is there anything else that you want to say closing down the interview?
No, just that I appreciate the time. And I think these conversations, I always say this, are so important to be had. These long form conversations, they beat out the 30-minute soundbite on a nightly news broadcast. You can get so much more information. And you may even pick up on something that was a side comment that neither of us even thought was worth more exploration. But for you as an individual, you said, you know what? That's very interesting. I'm going to go off on that tangent. And that is like the true crowdsourcing of information. So I hope every single person who listens to this takes something different away. And if you did, then it was a successful podcast. So I appreciate the time.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear from you too. Feel free to send us a message. We both love hearing from our community, and we learn from you guys just as much as you learned from us. And so thank you guys for your time. That's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening. It means a lot to me. And for future episodes, next week we've got Conspiracy Chronicles, from ancient plots to modern mind games. We'll have an interview with my friend Teresa talking about emotional freedom tapping, and a solo episode talking about fitness and hope molecules, and unpacking a little bit more about the emotional intelligence book I've been reading, and a couple more interviews. I think season 2 is going to go into October, and then we'll be closing it down. Thanks again for being here with me. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. And as always, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.